Thousands of nautical miles of open water stretch across the South Pacific Ocean. Why does the windswept, uninhabited island remain completely desolated? The surface appears firm enough to walk on. However, the extreme isolation confirms it is a place never meant for any human interference. At first glance, the rock seems stable, but in reality, the wind erodes it constantly. One can notice the total absence of vegetation on the jagged slopes. But this is just the beginning. The silence remains unbroken. 400 merino and merino cross sheep were brought ashore and completely abandoned on an unforgiving land in 1896. Domesticated animals usually require constant care, yet here there were no shelters and no supplemental feed provided. No shearing took place to relieve them of their heavy wool, and absolutely no human care was available. The animals were left to endure total isolation in the middle of the ocean. But this was only the start of a radical struggle. How could a flock bred for dependence on farmers endure such hostility for long? It seems inevitable that the harsh environment would claim them within months. Yet 75 years later, the sheep were not only alive, but had rewritten their survival strategies. One can notice how the landscape of Campbell Island offers little comfort to its inhabitants. Lying deep in the South Pacific Ocean, hundreds of kilometers from the New Zealand mainland, the terrain consists of cold rain and bare rock. Strong winds batter the coastline all year round without pause. It is visible how the vegetation clings to the earth, offering only scarce natural forage. But the challenge gets more complex further on. This remote land was officially recorded in 1810. An Australian ship's captain discovered it during a sealing voyage, naming the territory after the Campbell brothers who owned his vessel. At first glance, the location seems like a standard rocky outpost, but in reality, it became a secluded laboratory for evolutionary change. When humans finally returned, they witnessed a flock that barely resembled the animals originally released. Their appearance and behavior had shifted dramatically to cope with the rugged terrain. Thus, the abandoned flock began a unique existence far from human interference. 1896 marked the definitive turning point for Campbell Island's history. The territory was officially incorporated into New Zealand's pastoral lease system. Amidst a booming wool industry, a farmer named James Gordon from Gisborne identified a unique opportunity in this remote landscape. He signed the necessary lease documents to secure the land, but this is just the beginning of the venture. Gordon organized the complex transport of building materials across the treacherous sea. Why did he choose such an isolated location for farming? At first glance, the logistics seem impossibly difficult for a profitable business. The answer lies in the island's vast uninhabited area and the complete lack of competition for grazing resources. 400 sheep were unloaded onto the shore to kickstart wool production. It seems obvious that the open land would guarantee success, but in reality, the island's conditions did not unfold as expected. Financial difficulties mounted rapidly, forcing Gordon to surrender the lease after only a few years. The project appeared destined for collapse until management passed to Captain Tucker. Instead of withdrawing, he chose to aggressively expand the operation. Transition to the next level of logistical complexity ensues. One can notice how the scale of maritime transport increased significantly under new leadership. Tucker arranged multiple shipments to the island in the years that followed. Each vessel carried approximately 1,000 animals to stock the pastures. These were primarily merino and merino cross sheep, breeds specifically developed for high-quality wool production. Step by step, the fundamental role of Campbell Island began to shift permanently. From a landmass with almost no permanent human presence, it gradually transformed into a functional agricultural hub. Thus, the location became an isolated pastoral outpost standing alone in the middle of the ocean. Between 7,000 and 8,000 animals. Exactly this peak number was reached by the sheep population on Campbell Island by 1913. In the early years, the farm was maintained with a constant human presence. However, this scale quickly exceeded the environmental limits of the territory. One can notice how native vegetation vanished due to severe overgrazing. But this is just the beginning of the ecological shift. Why did the farming operations collapse by 1931? The reduction of the herd to 4,000 heads suggests a systemic crisis. The decline occurred because food resources diminished, making survival conditions increasingly harsh for the livestock. Workers found themselves completely isolated after operations were officially abandoned. With no ships and no means of communication with the mainland, the men remained stranded. They were forced to endure severe shortages for nearly 2 years before evacuation. It gets more complex further on. Even the arrival of the rescue vessel brought disappointment regarding their labor. At first glance, the wool collected over years seemed valuable, but in reality, it was not even enough to cover the cost of transportation. After humans left, the entire flock was abandoned to the wild. One can observe how the animals remained without shelters or regular shearing. Consequently, sheep that had been bred to depend on human care were forced to confront the cold climate. They faced relentless winds and chronic scarcity of resources entirely on their own. The herd began its independent survival in the harsh landscape. Total extinction. This was the only fate most observers predicted for the domesticated livestock abandoned on the island. Why did a breed accustomed to human care not perish on bare rocks? It would seem that cold winds and isolation guarantee a quick end. But contrary to expectations, the harsh environment inadvertently created a unique safety zone. The geography itself became an unexpected ally. Powerful winds blow almost constantly against the steep cliffs surrounding Campbell Island. One can notice how gusts sweep across the terrain, preventing parasitic insects from settling. Flies, which often carry deadly infections, simply cannot thrive in such turbulence. This climatic barrier removed one of the most common causes of death in sheep farming. But this is just the beginning. Another factor played a decisive role in the survival of the abandoned flock. At first glance, the wild environment seems full of dangers, but in reality, Campbell Island lacks terrestrial predators entirely. The animals do not face constant pursuit or life-threatening injuries. This spared them from critical stress during the vulnerable early period before they adapted to life in the wild. One can observe how the flock moves calmly without fear. As survival pressures eased, the island ecosystem began to rebalance itself. After sheep numbers dropped sharply in the early 1930s, the local vegetation received time to recover. One can see how native species, including large, distinctive plants known as megaherbs, gradually regenerated. The improvement of natural food sources provided the surviving animals with enough nutrition to sustain themselves. Thus, a rare pause in nature allowed the flock to continue existing under truly wild conditions. Zero guarantees protected the flock once the animals were abandoned on the remote landscape. Although the environment of Campbell Island offered favorable conditions, survival was far from easy. The population quickly underwent a period of harsh natural selection. But this was only the start of the trial. Why did mortality rates become extremely high during this early phase? The lush grass seemingly offered enough sustenance for everyone. Individuals unable to withstand the cold climate died before they had a chance to reproduce. At first glance, grazing looks simple, but in reality, those unable to move effectively across the rugged terrain perished. One can notice the struggle to utilize coarse natural food sources. Only the stronger sheep, those more cold-tolerant, managed to survive each passing winter. From this small group of survivors, the flock gradually stabilized. The population began to recover its strength steadily. 1931 marked the definitive departure of humans from Campbell Island, leaving the domesticated livestock to fend for themselves. Why did the sheep population undergo such a dramatic physical and behavioral transformation over the next 4 decades? The process did not happen over a few short years of neglect. Natural selection gradually honed the survivors, reshaping them into a group increasingly suited to life in the wild. Scientists returned to the location in 1975 to collect the last remaining individuals. One can notice that the scene confronting the researchers was entirely beyond expectation. At first glance, the animals appeared to be standard livestock, but in reality, they had clearly diverged from their mainland counterparts after generations of total isolation. But the physical differences were undeniable compared to familiar domesticated sheep. Adult sheep exhibited longer legs and a noticeably taller stance to navigate the geography. It is visible how their agility increased when moving across the island's rugged terrain. The wool was no longer uniform and soft like that of farmed sheep. But this is just the beginning. Because of the harsh elements, many fibers became coarse and visibly weather damaged by wind and heavy rain. Consequently, in some individuals, the fleece began to shed naturally in seasonal cycles rather than accumulating excessively. These changes were not limited to physical appearance alone. The flock's survival behavior had also evolved significantly to ensure continuity. Ewes acquired the ability to give birth while standing firmly on their feet. One can observe how the lambs were able to stand and move within just minutes of being born. It gets more complex further on. Further studies indicated that the flock had developed resistance to at least 2 diseases without medical intervention. They maintained extended daily activity from early morning until late evening to maximize foraging time. The sheep did not become a new species, but formed a unique evolutionary population reflecting the power of natural selection. 1937 marked the definitive year Campbell Island was designated as a protected area for flora and fauna. By 1954, the territory was officially declared a nature reserve, and conservation priorities gradually took precedence. What had once begun as a failed farming experiment had now evolved into a serious ecological problem. Why did humans have to confront the difficult question of whether the sheep should be allowed to continue existing there at all? The changes observed in the sheep astonished scientists, but in the eyes of environmental managers, they remained an invasive species continuing to place pressure on native vegetation. Subsequent legal decisions called for the complete removal of the sheep to restore the island's original ecosystem. Data from a scientific survey in 1958 estimated that the sheep population had fallen to fewer than 1,000 individuals. At first glance, it seemed the initial measures were having an effect, but in reality, the story did not end there. Because in the absence of natural predators, the remaining sheep continued to reproduce as lush vegetation began to recover. The risk of long-term ecological damage meant the intervention was only gaining momentum. Authorities were compelled to implement stronger measures, including the construction of wire fences to control movement. One can notice how organized culling campaigns were launched to systematically reduce the population. Approximately 3,000 sheep were removed over several successive operations. The environment was thus left to pursue its natural recovery. 1975 marked the start of a specific rescue mission to save a genetic code from total extinction. Although the sheep on Campbell Island were removed to restore the ecosystem, humans did not completely close the chapter on this remarkable population. A rescue effort was undertaken over 2 years to bring a small number of the remaining animals back to New Zealand. The goal was preserving the unique lineage that had formed after decades of total isolation. But this is just the beginning. Why make such an effort to transport feral animals across the ocean? The removal from the island was absolute and necessary for the local ecology. However, the genetic lineage developed in isolation held value that biologists refused to let vanish. The operation was far from easy, as the sheep had become fully feral and actively avoided human contact. After repeated attempts using sound signals to guide them, a few dozen individuals were finally gathered. One can notice how the strongest animals were carefully selected from this group to ensure resilience. Ultimately, only a very small group, around 10 individuals, was retained for breeding. It seems simple to catch domestic livestock, but in reality, their wild nature made every capture a struggle. Thanks to this decision, the lineage originating from Campbell Island did not disappear entirely, but continued to exist in captivity. Yet, the fate of this population remained fragile. In 2017, 5 of these rare sheep were stolen and slaughtered, reducing the total number to only about 30 individuals. It gets more complex further on. Several of the stolen animals were pregnant and only weeks away from giving birth. Despite this setback, the survivors continue to reproduce, preserving the final remnants of a lineage that once evolved independently in the middle of the ocean. $1 to $2 billion is the estimated economic loss caused by a single invasive species in the United States every year. The story of the sheep on Campbell Island is not a unique case, but merely a small fragment of a much broader pattern. When domesticated animals are separated from humans for long enough, nature begins to rewrite them. This process is not confined to a remote island, but is unfolding right within North America. But this is just the beginning. In states such as Texas, Florida, and California, it is visible how feral pigs shifted from ordinary farm animals to wild survivors. Why did these animals undergo such a drastic physical transformation? They were later released or abandoned, gradually slipping beyond human control. Forced to survive on their own without pens or guaranteed food, the harsh environment triggered rapid changes within just a few generations. One can notice how their bodies became more muscular while sharp tusks developed for defense. Their coats grew thicker, and their behavior turned increasingly aggressive. Unlike the sheep of Campbell Island, feral pigs in the United States did not evolve quietly in isolation. At first glance, it seems like a local issue, but in reality, they multiplied across farmland, forests, and suburban edges. It gets more complex further on. Therefore, they leave visible consequences where the ground is churned, causing heavy agricultural damage and ecological disruption. Because when humans withdraw, nature does not pause. It continues to select, adapt, and transform. Seen from this perspective, the sheep of Campbell Island can be understood as an early warning. Sometimes these changes occur in ways that remain unrecognized until the consequences have already become clear. One isolated island became the setting for a stark biological transformation. What unfolded on Campbell Island acts as a clear demonstration of how evolution operates when humans step aside. It reveals the raw mechanics of survival beyond the pages of textbooks. But this is just the beginning. Why did the ecosystem change so radically? The changes were subtle at first, because without artificial selection, nature simply continues its work of eliminating, adapting, and reshaping life across generations. At first glance, this was a failed farming venture, but in reality, it became a real-world evolutionary experiment. One can notice how the boundary between domestication and wilderness gradually blurred. Survival depended solely on natural resilience in the new environment. The process leaves behind a permanently changed world.